Good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem. Thank you so much for joining me as we continue tonight after a break of 1 week with our Torah Demystified series, exploring the wide world of Torah from A to Z. And tonight we are going to talk about the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Tonight's lecture is called Pure and Simple, an overview of the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Now, I want to begin with, I guess, a little bit of a disclaimer of sorts. I know I've called this pure and simple. Well, that's a little bit of a play on words, as I'm sure everybody appreciates. Now, the simple, I'm really going to try to make every effort to keep this as simple as possible. In fact, I think more importantly than anything else, my goal in trying to put together tonight's presentation was try to look at a very vast and to a certain extent an unfamiliar section, multiple sections of Torah, and try to simplify them, or at the very least present them in somewhat of a simplified way. But in doing so, unfortunately, there's sort of no way around it, almost by definition, that everything is oversimplified. And just to understand and to appreciate that not only are we sort of just scratching the surface here, which goes without saying, but even as I was sort of reviewing in the last couple of minutes what sort of made it to the final cut, it's occurring to me, that there are so many things that didn't make it to tonight's conversation. So I'm not even sure that I succeeded in trying to, present the biggest sort of overview possible. But we're going to try to do so, and hopefully everybody who's with us tonight will find tonight's conversation to be not only enlightening, but hopefully informative as well, because I think each and every one of us could definitely benefit from a little bit of a refresher at the very least. So the first thing I would like to do when we talk about Tumah, which is a word that we're going to use a lot tonight, which we usually translate as impurity, I want to point out that there is a difference between what we may call Tumas HaNefesh, which means impurity of the soul, as opposed to Tumas HaGuf, which we would call impurity of the body. Most of what we're going to talk about tonight is in the latter category of Tumas HaGuf, and when we think typically about purity and impurity and the purification process, we are thinking in terms of Tumas HaGuf. However, it is important to note, just for the sake of clarity, that there are numerous examples, and I'm going to cite here several, but there are numerous examples in which the Torah speaks about something which is tameh, which is describing something different than the most familiar type of tumah that we're going to address tonight. So, for example, over here you see a pasuk in Parashat Shmini, which says regarding the pig, "Vesachazir ki mafris parsahu v'shosa shesa parsa." The Torah tells us that the pig has split hooves, but nevertheless, v'hugera lo yigar, that it does not chew its cud. Tamehu lachem. A pig, according to the Torah, we know, of course, it's not kosher, and the Torah tells us it is tameh. Now, that is a concept that we're familiar with, and certainly doesn't strike, on the surface, doesn't sound unusual. However, it is important to note from the outset that actually a pig is not tameh. It's not tameh in the sense that we're going to discuss tonight. What the Torah seems to be describing over here is tumah in a more general sense, and maybe somewhat of a less literal sense, maybe in a spiritual sense. Here's another example. The Torah, at the end of the Sefer Bamidbar, is talking about the need to make sure that cities in Israel are set up in a way in which they are protected from any violent and murderous activities. And over there, the Torah says it's important to have violence and murder sort of removed from the land of Israel. Why? Because otherwise it will defile the earth. Now, of course, there is, an association between death and tumah, but that's not what the Torah is referring to over here. We're talking again about a concept of tumas hanefesh. Another example, over here the Torah talks about adultery as being a source of tumah. Over here also the Torah referring to tumah, and maybe coming at from a different angle, a very famous pasuk in Sefer Tehillim, Leiv tahor barali elokim v'rach nachon chadesh bekirbi. Over here, David HaMelech is referring to a pure heart. So all of these are examples in which either the word tumah or tameh is used, or tahar, and it is describing something different than that which we are going to really focus on tonight, namely a tumas haguf. And for the purpose of just sort of presenting this in the clearest forms, I wanted to put together like a little bit of a chart over here, a little table, if you will. You'll bear with me for a moment, and I want to differentiate between the two. So the first thing is that Tumas HaNefesh, as it is typically found in the Torah, in the examples that we gave and others, is a negative description. In all of those cases, and you'll find this across the board without exception, the Torah is describing a situation, a circumstance, a state of being which is negative. Tumas HaGuf is not negative per se. It is at best, I would say, well, I say it's worse, it's like a neutral description. As we're going to see tonight, there are certain parts of life, features of life, circumstances, experiences, which are natural, and sometimes in the course of a mitzvah, which generate and transmit tumah. So the Torah over there, when it is not describing, when we talk about Tumas HaGuf, is not describing anything that's negative. Tumas HaNefesh clearly is. Tumas HaNefesh, it would seem to me, is sort of a conceptual reality, and it is describing a value, something negative, as we just mentioned. Tumas HaGuf reflects an actual reality, and maybe I'll qualify that by calling it a metaphysical reality, but it's not describing a value. When we say that a person, came in contact with a corpse and therefore is tameh, that doesn't mean that the person is a bad person. It doesn't mean the person has done anything wrong. It doesn't mean that in some way the person has sinned, is in need of somehow changing anything about himself. Absolutely not. There is a reality that this person has contracted, something which the Torah calls tumah. Another point of difference is that when it comes to Tumas HaNefesh, it is not precipitated by any exposure. It's not that anyone has come in contact with anything which has made them tameh. Tumas HaGuf, on the other hand, obviously is introduced by exposure to a source of impurity, which we're going to talk about tonight. And finally, when it comes to Tumas HaNefesh, there's no defined method of purification, right? You don't, even though we can certainly speak about tshuva, etc., as being a way of transforming oneself from being in a state of Tumas HaNefesh, but certainly going to the mikvah will not automatically erase what we call Tumas HaNefesh. Tumas HaGuf, of course, does have very defined methods of purification, some of which we are familiar with, and others of which we're going to review tonight. The Malbim, actually, I don't want to spend much time on this, but the Malbim points out that if you look closely at the text in the Torah, you will actually see that there is a difference in terms of the way one type of Tumah is presented and the other one. The Malbim basically says when you have something which is what we've been calling Tumas HaNefesh, so that is something which usually comes with a modifier of sorts, which is followed by the letter base. So, for example, we saw some of these examples. This is El Eishes HaMischalo Sitein Shaftacha L'Tama Ba Al Tavakshu L'Tama Bahem V'Nitmeisem Bum V'Yitamu B'Maasehem. These are some different psukim as well that we didn't quote beforehand. This is all describing. This is the way the Torah formulates a description of Tumas HaNefesh. Tumas HaGuf, however, is described either sort of objectively, without any modifier of any sort, it's not necessarily connected, or it is la yitama, or li. So the Malbim is just pointing out in his very familiar and very sort of special sort of style and approach to understanding Chumash, is that when we look at the text itself, there are certain clues that can help us understand whether or not something is referring to Tumas HaNefesh or Tumas HaGuf. Now I want to talk a little bit about the nature of Tumah. Before we're going to talk about the practical aspects of Tumah, what is Tumah? How can we describe its nature, its essence? So there are several very, very famous and I would say very commonplace explanations, and I want to just share a couple of them with you tonight. I'm sure there are many, many others that we're not going to present tonight. The first I'd like to present comes from the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, and I'm not even going to provide you with the text over here, but I gave you the source so you can take a look inside in the second section of the Sefer Kuzari. In paragraph 60, 61, 62, 63, several paragraphs, the Kuzari talks about Tumah and basically says that all Tumah stems from death. Now, tonight, we're not going to have the opportunity to really, really explore that, because while there are certain examples which are obvious, Tumah emanating from death, in some cases, it's not as obvious. But he says at its core, all Tumah is coming from death, and Tumah exists in the absence of potential. And those concepts are related, right? If life means that there is the possibility of potential, of growth, of progress, of building, of becoming better and bigger and stronger. So death, which is the cessation of life, means the absence of potential, the end of potential. He also points out that the holier the individual or the object is, the more sensitive it is to exposure to Tumah. And we're going to talk about that in a practical sense tonight. So this is part of the idea of Rabbi Yehuda Levi. Sham Shulchan Hirsch also presents Tumah in a similar light, and I'm sure others do as well, that Tumah stems from death and from the absence of potential. Compare this with the Rambam in Hilchos Mikvos, where the Rambam somewhat typically says, Davar barur v'galui shehatumos v'ataras gezeres hakosavhein. Says the Rambam, it is very clear and evident that when we speak about Tumah and Tahara, purity, impurity, this is a gezeres hakosav, which means it's a divine decree, and we don't really understand it. This is not the kind of thing that could be deciphered and understood by your intellect alone. You want to understand it? Says the Rambam, you're not going to understand it. It's a chok. You want to understand why we go to the mikvah? We immerse ourselves in a mikvah to remove tumah? Says the Rambam, it's a chok. This is something that we don't understand. It's not as if we are dirty and we are entering the mikvah like we would go into a bath or a shower to remove the dirt, the sediment from our body. That's not what's happening. Rather, it's gezeres hakosov. Nevertheless, says the Rambam, but there is still sort of a message, a hidden message, or maybe not hidden, that's sort of embedded beneath the surface that we can and should pay attention to. And says the Rambam as follows: when a person immerses oneself in the mikvah and they come out, something transformational takes place, even though when you look at them, they look exactly the same. They don't look any different. Maybe their skin is wet, but besides that, that you look exactly like you did a moment ago before you immersed in the mikvah. But yet we know there's been an extraordinary, significant transformation that's taken place. Says the Rambam, the same is true when a person wants to be matarer. Here again, taras hanefesh, wants to purify one's soul. A person needs to put their heart and their mind in the right direction. And I don't want to say it's as simple as that, but says the Rambam, you can't transform yourself by your machshav alone, by your thought alone. If I say, I don't want to live my life this way anymore, I want to change myself, I want to set myself on a different course, says the Rambam, that is possible. And where do we see sort of a dimyon for this? Says the Rambam, we see it from the Tumah, which is described in the Torah, the Tumah that we don't really understand. So on the one hand, the Rambam is saying, you want to understand Tumah, Tahara, you can't. They are chukim, but yet they would provide us with sort of a model of inspiration of personal growth. Very nice idea. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, however, does actually attempt to explain why it is that the Torah presents the laws of Tumah. This is a fascinating approach that the Rambam takes over here. I'm going to go through this very quickly. But says the Rambam, the Tumah, which the Torah seems to obsess over in many cases, in many situations and places, is all about making sure that we don't spend too much time in the mikdash. Says the Rambam, the Torah tells us, umikdashi tirohu, that we are to have a special amount of reverence and honor. Maybe we would even say fear, real, genuine respect and honor in the mikdash. And says the Rambam, human nature is that when we spend too much time in any place, we get used to it, and we tend to respect it less, not more. And therefore, the Torah wanted to essentially prevent us from being able to access the mikdash more often than we should. And therefore, what happens? So says the Rambam, the Torah presents us with all of these obstacles. And then he goes list through many of the sources of Tumah, which we're going to discuss tonight, which basically make it, says the Rambam, that even if you're living a very, very normal, unremarkable life, and you're just sort of experiencing the things of every day and encountering different peoples in different places and eating food and engaging in marital relations, all of these things, says the Rambam, will sooner or later generate Tumah. So much so, says the Rambam, that it's going to be hard to really spend more than, a couple of hours, a day or two in the mikdash without having to leave to purify oneself and then return. So this is a fascinating idea. Whereas the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah says, why do we have the laws of Tumah and Tahara? We don't really understand. In the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam suggests that the laws of Tumah and Tahara are designed, he doesn't say in part, but I guess we could say perhaps at least in part, to the idea that the Torah wants to see to it that we don't spend too much time in the mikdash. Now, what are the sources of Tumah? Most of what we're going to talk tonight, from this point on, is going to be in the realm of the technical. I'm going to say, as I said before, it is my hope and expectation, it is certainly my goal, to try to present things in the most simple way possible. A lot of what we're going to do from this point on is very technical. It's technical. I hope that's going to interest all of you. But for those of you who are looking for, ideas and thoughts that are more inspirational, I hope you're inspired, but this is not necessarily going to be the most inspirational material. That being said, I really hope, and I believe that many of us can actually be genuinely inspired when we have the opportunity to review, at least on a very, like I said, a very superficial level, the vast world of Tumah, which is what we're going to explore right now. So what are the sources of Tumah? So there are four primary sources of Tumah that are found in the Torah. The first one, I'm going to group these together, even though technically we could have separated them. A human corpse or an animal carcass in specific situations. Not every animal carcass is going to generate Tumah, but in some cases, yes. And a human corpse, that should be obvious, is going to be a source of Tumah. Another one is a Tumah that is released from the body. We're going to give examples for each and every one of these, but one example, of course, a very famous, familiar example, was in a situation of a Nida. There are going to be other cases as well, as Zava, etc. The other case, or another one, is Saras, a Metzora, that is, who develops Saras. I didn't want to use the word leprosy because that's often how we translate Saras, but it's probably not. But leprosy is a disease that many say has similar features to that of Saras, but Saras clearly is a disease, well, Chazal tell us it's one that we don't have anymore. It's not something that we see, but it is a disease which is a reflection of a spiritual failing on the part of person. And we know that while Lashon Hara is not the only sin which causes saras, it's one of numerous sins that the Gemara in Erchan tells us. But it comes as a result of a person's certain behaviors. So that saras makes a person tamei. And finally, I'm just going to read this right now, but we're going to define it more later. Chatos, which refer to certain types of sacrifices and their derivatives, which are going to generate tumah. So here we are reducing all of the primary sources of tumah into basically four categories: a human corpse or an animal carcass in certain situations, tumah that is released from the body, tsaras, and chatos. These categories consist of 10 sources of Tumah Midaraisa. So now we're going to list them, meaning we have four categories, and we're going to break them down into 10 examples. So the first is human corpse. We're going to start with this for several reasons. Later on, we'll name it as being the Aviyavos HaTumah, so you'll understand and appreciate more why it is that I wanted to start with the human corpse. This is not the first instance of Tumas HaGuf that is recorded in the Torah, but conceptually makes sense to sort of start with that. So this is known as Aviyavos HaTumah. We're going to talk a little more later about the concept of an Av HaTumah and a Vlad HaTumah, but this is known as the Aviyavos HaTumah, which means the highest level of Tumah. Aviyavos means literally the father of the fathers of Tumah, meaning as the highest source level of Tumah from any human corpse, Jew or non-Jew, and even a fetus 40 days after conception. Prior to that point, if an embryo doesn't really develop much and reach much in terms of development in utero, so it would not be a source of tumah. But otherwise, even a stillborn baby, lo aleinu, would be a source of tumah, as would any human corpse. Tumah can be transferred to another person, vessels, and food. So when we're talking about tumas hameis, it can be transferred to basically anything. And we're going a little later, we'll be able to appreciate that not everything can transfer tumah to a person, but tumas hameis certainly can. And interestingly, unique to this category, tumas hameis can be transmitted through tumas ohel, which means we're going to define this a little more later. But even without direct contact with the mace, if let's say there's a corpse that's found in a building or a house, and there's another person who's in the house or the building at the same time, generally speaking, we would say that the person who was in the house and kalim and other things as well would become tamei. So the tumas hameis is transmitted in very, very unique ways. This again is all from the Torah, and it requires a very unique purification process, which involves 7 days, as we know, and what we call the mechatos, the meparaduma, the details of which are found in the beginning of Parshas Chukas. Another type, or I would say the second type in this list, is what's called tumas nevela. Now, a nevela is an animal that dies without proper shechita. Generally, when we are handling, let's say, meat that we would buy in the store, be it a chicken or beef, whatever the case may be, this is meat that has been shechted properly. An animal that dies naturally, or let's say there was a shechita, but the shechita was not done properly, so that animal generates tumah. The carcass generates tumah. The tumah that a person contracts only lasts for 1 day. 1 day, and they would have to go to the mikveh, and at the end of the day, this person would become tahar. So obviously, that's very different than tumas mace that we defined earlier, which requires a purification process of 7 days. The tumah can only be transmitted through direct contact or by carrying. So whereas tumas mace we mentioned could be transmitted through ohel, that is not true when it comes to tumas nevela. And when it comes to a bird, a a nevela of a bird, I mean, a bird that was shechted improperly, Tumah can only be transmitted by swallowing. So it's, again, a very, very unique, it's a detail. It's a very small detail, but it's one that's found in the Torah, and the kind of thing that, sometimes when we are reading these very, very technical, unfamiliar sections of the Torah, we don't necessarily pay attention to the details. So it's worthwhile to just point out and for us to appreciate that there's a difference between the way Tumas nevela from a behema or a chay is transmitted as opposed to a bird. And then we have a concept of Tumas sheretz. The Torah actually mentions 8 unique species of, we would sometimes call them creepy, crawly sort of things. We could talk a lot about what the Shemona Shvatim are. We're not going to do so right now. I will translate them for you. There is probably a lot that can be discussed and debated about these particular definitions and designations, because, of course, the Torah doesn't give us English, and here I've given you English. We make all sorts of assumptions based on research and presentations as to what exactly the Shemona Shvatim are. But we're going to name them as a mole, a mouse, a spiny-tailed lizard, a monitor lizard, and a gamma lizard, a fringe-toed lizard, a chameleon, and a gecko. But I know you noticed that there are no pictures tonight. It's too bad. We could have had a lot of fun with pictures tonight, but simply too much material, so no time for pictures. We'll get back to pictures another time. Anyway, so these are the Shemona Shvatim. What else do we know about the Shemona Shvatim? The Tumah is transmitted only through direct contact. So there's certainly no Tumas Ohel, and not even Tumas Masa. Over here, it's only through direct contact. And here again, the Tumah lasts for 1 day. That's the concept of the Tumas Sheretz. Another type is a Balkari. This is Tumah that is generated by seminal emission. This is true whether it was involuntary or even intentional. Let's say in the course of sexual relations, if there is semen that is emitted from a man's body, so this generates Tumah. The semen itself is considered an avatuma, which means, like, again, a high level, and it can transmit to other people, clothing or vessels. So that means the man himself, and if let's say he's with a woman, will become tameh. But here again, actually, it's not here on the page. The Tumah only lasts for 1 day. So immediately after this exposure, the man, the woman, whatever the case may be, go to the mikveh and purify oneself. The man has a status of a rishon l'tumah and may only transmit to food or beverages. So somewhat of a technicality over there. The semen itself is an avatuma, but the man that has contracted the semen is what's touched it, rather, come in contact with it, is what's called a rishon l'tumah. Then there's a concept of a zav, which is different. This is something which is less typical, less usual. This is tumah which is generated by an emission or discharge from a man which is not semen. This is something else. Also, again, some type of a disease, which it's not tzara, it's not the same thing, but the likes of which we don't, if we see it today, we're not even sure if we do see it. The status depends on the number of emissions that he has. This requires 7 clean days, forgive me for the typo, 7 clean days before purification. The concept that we are familiar with known as shiva nekiyim, meaning it's not enough that a person, the count doesn't start until these re'ios, these emissions come to an end. And purification in this case can only take place in a mayon. Generally speaking, we don't really speak much about mikveh yet. Most situations, purification takes place in a mikveh. When it comes to a zav, it has to be a mayon. A mayon means a natural spring. So you can find mikvahs all over the place. There are thousands of mikvahs all over the world. When you're traveling places, finding a mayon is a little difficult. On the other hand, we don't really have situations today where a person is a zav and they're looking for a mayon. But on a Torah level, it requires a mayon for purification. Another interesting, I don't say it's a detail of sorts, but a stringency when it comes to Tumas Zav is a concept known as Tumas Midras. Again, each and every one of these could really be, a topic in of itself. I'm actually going to move on right now and not even get into the definition. Now, Nida, again, very, very familiar to each and every one of us. This is another example. I think we're up to 5. I don't know, we're up to 5 or 6. Now, Adina, of course, is a woman who's menstruating. This, again, going back to what I said beforehand, this is normal. There's nothing unusual here. It's certainly not a result of a sin or anything like that. So this type of description is not like Tumas Nefesh, where we say it's sort of a negative description. This is what we call neutral. It's not negative at all. It's just part of, it's in Hagush Olam, it's part of the normal natural course of the world. This Tumah lasts for 7 days. In addition to the Tumah, there is a separate prohibition to engage in marital relations. Now, really, we could talk for at least an hour, if not more, on this point alone. We're not going to, but I think it's very, very important for a moment to just stop and point out the obvious, and that is that for the most part, we do not observe, we do not monitor Tumah V'Tahara today, right? We don't have the ability to properly be Matara ourselves from Tumas Mace. And so therefore, when we are exposed to different forms of Tumah, for the most part, we don't do anything about it. The reason why a woman who's a Nida is prohibited to be with her husband is not because of the fact that she is Tmeya in the sense that, she's impure, because if that were true, then marital relations would always be permitted. When it comes to this particular situation, there is sort of a separate Issa Labala. There's a prohibition for a man and woman to live together when she is in a state of Tumas Nida, but it is separate from. We have to sort of tease it out from the tuma itself. Now, sometimes we will use the word tuma. We will say when a woman is tmeya, and it's okay to use the term in that regard. But we have to understand and appreciate, even when she goes to the mikveh, she's still tmeya in a sense, right? Because if she ever came in contact with a corpse, for example, or went to a funeral, she's going to be tmeya anyway. So the tuma, the mikveh does remove, I'll say it a little differently. The tuma removes the mikveh removes the tuma so that the woman can then go ahead and return to her husband, but doesn't remove tuma entirely. So again, so much more to say on this, but we're gonna move on. Now, a zava. So a zav, as you remember, is a word that describes a situation involving a man. A zava, which is sort of the female version of that, is bleeding that is not associated with menstruation. So this is not the kind of thing that a person would be able to calculate or evaluate and monitor today, even though we are certainly familiar with the concept of, a menstrual cycle that is sort of on time. And then if a woman has, let's say, mid-cycle bleeding, it may be tempting to say, oh, well, that's not damnida, so she must be a zava. But we don't do that for lots and lots of technical reasons. When I say we don't do it, it's not like here in Teaneck in the 21st century. Already the Gemara tells us that that whatever sort of tradition Masorah once existed in order to be able to decipher one from the other has been lost. And so therefore, for all intents and purposes, we treat every nida with the chumras of a zava. So therefore, every nida today requires 7 clean days. I don't know if you remembered, on the previous page, we saw that a nida requires the tumas for 7 days. That includes the days of bleeding itself. So if a woman, let's say, has tumas nida, menstruates for 5 days, in theory, she'd be able to go to the mikvah on day 7. It doesn't require 7 clean days. The concept of 7 clean days, Shiva Nikiyim, comes from or is associated with a zava. Practically speaking, it is difficult to differentiate between nida and zava, and the laws have evolved accordingly, as I mentioned. A yoledes, a tumah generated by childbirth. In this case, the tumah after birth of a boy lasts for 7 days, and it's 14 days after the birth of a girl. This is something which is found in the beginning of Parshas Tazria. Again, going back to what we mentioned beforehand, the Rambam tells us these are all chukim. On the other hand, others have explained, well, why should there be a difference between the amount of tumah for a boy and a girl? So going back to some ideas that we spoke about before in terms of potential, there are some beautiful ideas that have been suggested to explain this distinction, but certainly, logically speaking, there should be no reason to make this distinction. But this is what the Torah says. After the birth of a boy, there's tumah that lasts for 7 days, and 14 days after the birth of a girl, followed by 33 days of purity of Tahara for a boy, or 66 days of purity following the birth of a girl. So here you have again, I don't say random, but some basic set of features, facts, laws, if you will, regarding Tumas Yoledes. Then there's Tsaras, Matzora, and Neged Tsaras. These are, of course, many, many complex laws that are found in the Torah, Tazria, Matzora. There's entire Masechtim in Mishnayos, Masechtas Negoim. Very, very complex, very detailed, very complicated. We know that Neged Tsaras can be found on a person's body, on their clothing, or even on a house in Eretz Yisrael. So this is very, obviously, we're not really going to get into the details of Tsaras right now, but some very, very technical aspects of Neged Tsaras. And this also requires a period of quarantine before proceeding with steps towards purification. This is, again, is something which makes it somewhat unique. This is a feature which is separate and distinct from other situations of Tumah. Tumas Chatos, so this is Tumah that is generated by specific sacrifices called Chatos Panimios. Generally speaking, according to Chatos, the blood is going to be sprinkled on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the Mizbeach that is outside of the inner section of the temple. This week's Parsha Truma. So there are 2 altars. There's the Mizbeach HaChitzon and then the Mizbeach HaPnimi. So a Chatos Pnimis is a type of sacrifice in which the the blood is going to be sprinkled inside in the heichal, in the kodesh. Some of the chatos on this list are the Paran Yom Kippurim, the Siyur Shel Yom Kippurim, Parkon and Mashiach. So these are specific types of animals. These sacrifices are burned outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So nobody eats them. They are burned outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and those who are involved in handling or burning these sacrifices contract tumah. So this is another one of the sort of the sources of tumah. I think we said there are 10. This may be number 10. I'm not sure. Meichatos. We all know what this is, although some of us may be less familiar with the term. Tumah that is contracted by one who touches or carries the meichatos. The meichatos is a term that the Torah uses to describe the mei paraduma. The paraduma, the red heifer, we burn its body, we take the ashes, and we mix it in water, and there's a special concoction, if you will, that is used to purify a person who became tamei meis. This itself transmits, or I would say generates tumah, which is often cited as an example of the quintessential paradox. People call this the ultimate chok, because the very source of purity generates tumah. It's very, very strange, right? The mei chatas is used to purify someone, but the person who is facilitating that, people come in contact, direct contact with the mei chatas, themselves become tamei. So it doesn't generate the same type of tumah as tumas meis, but still, that concept is something which is beyond logic. There are also types of tumah midrabanan. Everything we just mentioned. Let's take a break for a moment. Deep breath. I know we just saw a lot. By the way, all of these the materials, even though you can't download them where you're right now, we always post them on the website and while you're Torah, so you're welcome to take them down and review them, because I know again there's a lot of technical information that I'm sharing with you tonight. But I do think it's very beneficial to sort of take a look at the totality of our conversations about tumah, even though we're doing this on a very, very, very oversimplified, superficial level. So we just saw 10 sources of tumah from the Torah. There are also several sources of tumah midrabanan. Some of them are eretz ha'amim. Those who leave the boundaries of Israel become tamei. There are lots of reasons for that, but one of them is because of the fact that we are not 100% sure where people are buried outside the land of Israel. There's another concept somewhat familiar, a Beis HaPras, which is a field in which there was a grave which became plowed over. For those who learned Daf Yomi a couple of weeks ago, there were discussions in the Gemara about Beis HaPras. There are actually different interpretations of what exactly Beis HaPras is, but that's the most common interpretation. There was a field in which there was a grave. We don't know exactly where it was, or more importantly, where it is now. And so there's a concern that maybe at any point in this field, there may be remnants of a mace. And this is something which is going to be tamei midrabanan. Another example, nothing to do with real tumah, but Chazal would go there that there's tumah on objects of idolatrous worship or sacrifices. They are to be considered tamei. This is a reflection of the very, very severe prohibition of avodah zarah. So now we're going to talk about that which can receive tumah. I don't know if receivers is the technically proper word for this. In Hebrew we say that which is makabel tumah, that which receives tumah, that which can be susceptible tumah. So if you have a better word to use, let me know, and maybe I'll consider it next time. But tonight I'm going to call these the receivers of tumah, as opposed to the source, right? So not everything is roy l'kabel tumah. So that's the first thing we should realize, that just because something exists, just because something is part of the physical material world, doesn't mean that it could be makabel tumah, which means not everything can become tamei, even if it comes in direct contact with, let's say, the avi avos tumah, a mace. Something which is not roy l'kabel tumah remains in a state of purity, even following direct contact with the source of tumah. So tumah, sort of like, if you want to compare it to other things in the physical world, right? Tumah is not something which is physical; it is metaphysical. I'd rather not use the word spiritual. You could use that as well. So, just like within the world of nature, there are certain, for example, water will gather and collect in certain areas, and it will become absorbed into certain materials, and it won't become absorbed into others, and it will just sort of flow down others. This is just part of the natural world. Similarly, tumah won't necessarily be transmitted to everything. Something has to be roy l'kabel tumah. Another interesting thing about Kabbalas tumah can only be transmitted from the source to something on a lower level. Now, I'm not going to really define that yet. We're going to get to this later, but there is going to be sort of a hierarchy of sorts, and there are going to be higher levels and lower levels, and tumah can only transmit down. It cannot transmit up. We're going to define that a little more in a bit. Tumah can only be transmitted when source and receiver are of a certain prescribed measurements. So just because something is a source of tumah or roy lakabel tumah, as far as the material is concerned, may not be enough. There are also other technical details, including the size, the measurements. Receivers of tumah can be divided into 4 categories. This may be cut off on your screen. My apologies, but I'll read it to you. Adam, Kalim, Olchlin, and Mashkin. A person can be makabel tumah. Kalim, which include vessels, not all vessels, but some vessels, and clothing, could be makabel tumah. Ochlin, which means food, and mashkin, which are drinks, liquids, beverages. Any one of these translations will do. So now we're going to go through each and every one of these one by one. Tumas Adam. Only Jews can be makabel tumah, although, as mentioned, the corpse of a non-Jew does generate tumah. So if a non-Jew dies, that corpse, his or her body does generate tumah, would give off tumah, but a non-Jew would not be makabel tumah, right? Cannot receive tumah. Only a Jew can be makabel tumah. If the source of tumah comes from an illness, so purification can only follow healing. So, for example, we spoke about zav and zava and saras. In these situations, a person cannot go through the process of purification until the source, or we'll call it the illness itself, is no longer there, and the person is now in the stage of healing. So it's an interesting sort of prerequisite for moving on. Tumas kalim, when we're talking about vessels, not all vessels may contract tumah. Vessels made from, forget the typo, made from the following materials may contract. That's a very strange typo. Okay, if you're looking at the screen right now and still awake, I'm not even going to read that word. I don't know why that's there. May contract tumah. Wood, leather, metal, and others. This is not a complete list, but these are some familiar materials that we are, I'm sure, familiar with. Something which is attached or firmly affixed to the ground cannot contract tumah. That's very interesting. Something which is attached to the ground, we call that mechuber l'karka, cannot be makabel tumah. The ground itself cannot be makabel tumah. Something which is attached to the ground, in a sense, halachically speaking, becomes like the ground itself, and therefore cannot be makabel tumah. In order for specific vessels to contract tumah, they must meet specific qualifications, again, with the details of which we're not going to get into right now. Then there's something called tumas ochlin, when food becomes tumah. All types of foods can contract tumah. So whereas we were specific when it came to kalim, for example, it's not true when it comes to food. Food which grows on trees or in the ground must first be mukhshar lakabel tumah. There's a concept of foods having, before they can be makabel tumah, they have to have been exposed to liquids, not all liquids, but many liquids. And once they have been exposed to liquids, even if they're no longer wet, they can now be makabel tumah. Foods with higher degrees of kedusha have greater degrees of susceptibility to contracting tumah. So it's very interesting that, and we're going to see this a little more in a moment, that there are certain foods. I mean, most foods that we eat, we call that chulin, which means comes from the word chol. It's just lacking an inherent kedusha. But there is something called truma, and there's kachim. There are certain types of foods which we don't really handle or use, and certainly try not to create today, because there's no use for it without the ability to be matar ourselves properly outside of the mikdash, etc. But they do have high degrees of susceptibility. They're a little more sensitive, if you will, to contracting tumah. What are the tumas makshin? There are seven types of liquids that can contract tumah. They are wine, honey, oil, milk, dew, blood, and water. Why did I list them in this order? So many are familiar with the famous mnemonic. The Chazal tell us yad shachat dam. Yad shachat dam, which doesn't really mean anything per se, but those are the every one of these 7 things. So wine, for example, is yayin. So there you get the yud. Honey is dvash. So there's the dalid, yad, shachat, the shemen, ches is from the milk, and tal is the dew, and the blood is the dalid, and the water is the mem, the mayim. So there's yad, shachat, dam. A nice way to remember it. Now, as regarding the transmission of tumah, so now we're going to also present, again, hopefully in the simplest way possible, but a couple of set of basic rules. There's something called tumas maga. Tumas maga maybe is the most obvious of all, and that is physical contact between the source of tumah and that which is receiving. So much like, if you will, certain germs that can only be transmitted through direct physical contact, tumah, one type of transmission of tumah, happens through what we call tumas maga, which means touching. Then there's something called tumas masa. This is tumah which is transmitted when an individual carries the source of tumah, even in the absence of any physical touch. So not every type of tumah can be transmitted by carrying, but one type of transmission is called tumas masa. So that would mean, let's say, if a person is carrying something, but there's something in between. So if I put something, let's say, on top of a pillow, let's say, so there's a concept of tumas masa. Even though I'm not touching it directly, it may still tumah can be transmitted. This only applies by certain avos tumah. So as I mentioned before, not everything on this list can necessarily be transmitted in one of these ways. Then there's something called tumas heset, which is tumah that is transmitted through movement, even without direct physical contact, such as a scale. So if I touch one side of the scale and the other side moves, or a swing or something like that, this only applies by a zava, a nida, a yoledes, and according to some opinions, a mitzora. Don't worry, I'm not testing you afterwards. But again, bear with me. This is great. If you're still here, this is great. Then we have something called tumas ohel. Tumas ohel only applies with tumah generated by a human corpse. I mentioned this earlier. What are the types of tumas ohel? There are basically three. A person leans over, or the object is suspended directly over a corpse. So the person who's leaning over, or the object that is suspended over the corpse becomes tameh. That's called tumas ohel. Another type of tumas ohel is the corpse is suspended over a person or an object below. So tumas ohel doesn't only work when the tumah is going up, but the tumah can also sort of go down, if you will. Again, you have to use your imagination a little bit, because it's not something you actually see, but in this metaphysical world of transmission of tumah, that's what tumah works. And the third, and perhaps in some ways the most familiar with, a corpse or the person or the object are under the same roof. This is not only a roof, it could be an overhang, even a tree. If, let's say, there's a tree that has branches that are extending in different directions, and you have a corpse under one part of the tree, and you have a person or kalim standing under the other part of the tree, so the tumah becomes transmitted. Tumas ohel is a very, very relevant sugya in halacha. Why? Because even though I mentioned earlier that we do not observe the laws of tumah v'tahara today, that's true regarding everybody except kohanim. Kohanim, of course, are forbidden from coming in contact with a mace even today. Even though they are not serving in the mikdash, there is still a separate prohibition from the Torah to come in contact with a mace. And so therefore, a Kohen has to be careful not only to avoid direct contact with the mace, but being in the same building. And it's for that reason, I'm sure most of you, all of you probably are familiar, that a Kohen won't go to a cemetery, a Kohen is not going to go to a funeral, or won't be in a building, sometimes even a hospital, all things being equal. A Kohen should try to avoid, can't always avoid it, but rather than be under the same roof, as a mace, there are many, many questions that come up regarding these types of shilas. And if you are a Kohen or you're related to Kohen, or you study these laws, you know how fascinating and complex they can be. Then there's something called tumas moshav umishkav. This is when a zav or similar types of avos tumah sits or leans on an object of furniture which is designated for the purpose, even without direct physical contact. And I said at the end more. There's more over here. We're not getting to it right now. I don't want you to think these are all the methods of transmission, because they're not. Now, as far as levels, I referred to this earlier, but I want to come back to this. As a general rule, tumah can only be transmitted from a higher level to a lower level. That we mentioned. As tumah is transmitted, it becomes weaker through transmission. So this is probably the first and only time that I will tell you to think about. It's probably, I'm not even sure that this is necessarily a good dimyon, a mashal, a metaphor, if you will, but maybe we could say the same thing about certain types of diseases, that as they are transmitted, maybe they get weaker over time. This is probably actually not technically so. So it's probably the wrong time in history for me to go be offering my understanding of infectious diseases. But anyway, as tumah is transmitted, it becomes weaker and weaker through transmission. This is an interesting thing. It sort of dies down as it goes on. A higher primary level is what's called an avatuma, literally a father, but it doesn't mean a father in that sense, but it's the higher level, the primary source. The secondary level is called a vlada tumah, which means a descendant of, a derivative of that source of tumah. Ava tumah can transmit tumah to a person or to objects, whereas a vlada tumah can only transmit tumah to food or beverages. Now, there's something called avi avos hatumah. This is a term which is used to describe a corpse. A corpse is avi avos hatumah. It's the highest level. This term reflects the fact that a person who contracts tumah from a corpse becomes himself an avatumah. So an avatumah, we said, is sort of the highest level. That's true with the exception of a mace. A corpse is considered the avi avos hatumah, and so therefore a person who comes in contact with a mace is still considered on that high level of an avatumah. Under certain circumstances, circumstances, an object which touches a corpse can also become an avatuma. That's based on the principle known in halacha of cherev harei kacholol. I'm just mentioning it, but not going to define it beyond at this point. An avatuma. This is a term that is used to describe all other primary sources of tumah, such as azav, mitzvah, sheretz, any primary source, right? Meaning that the tumah comes from this person, this thing itself. That's called an avatuma. This can transmit to another person or to vessels, to kalim or to clothing, as we mentioned, or of course to food. So after the avatuma, if that tumah becomes transmitted, it's going to generate or it's going to create what we call a rishon tumah. This is a term that is used to describe anything which contracts tumah from an avatuma. So remember what I told you beforehand, that as the tumah becomes transmitted, it becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. So it starts either on the level of a yevos hatuma or an avatuma, and then it becomes transmitted, and now it's called a rishon tumah. It cannot transmit tumah to another person or another vessel because it's already on the level of rishon tumah, and it cannot transmit tumah beyond to another person. So that would mean, let's say let's say there was a dead sheretz, and a person touches the sheretz, that person is a tameh. If that person touches another person, that other person, the second person, does not become tameh, because tumah cannot transmit from an avatuma to a rishon tumah and then to another person. However, it can transmit tumah to food, or mashkin, as we're going to see in a moment. A sheni l'tumah, as you probably guessed, is a term which is used to describe anything which contracts tumah from a rishon l'tumah. So this is, again, the next level. Now, on a Torah level, this can only apply to food or drinks, right? On a Torah level, a rishon l'tumah cannot be matame anything except for food or drinks. So when we're speaking about a sheni l'tumah on a Torah level, we're talking about something with food or drinks. Tumah cannot be transmitted beyond this point to anything which is chulin. Chulin means anything which doesn't have a special holy designation. However, a shlishi l'tumah, when you probably think, wait a second, why do you have a shlishi l'tumah? You just said it can't go beyond. A shlishi l'tumah is a term that's used to describe anything which contracts tumah from a sheni l'tumah, and this can only include truma and kodesh. So that would mean that if something was a sheni l'tumah and it touches, somebody's lunch, a hamburger, which is chulin, it's not a problem. It's not going to become tameh. But if that food is truma or it's kodesh, part of, let's say, kudshim, part of a carbon or something like that, so then the truma does become passed. The tumah becomes passed on. And the final level is what we call the revi l'tumah, which is a term used to describe anything which contracts tumah from a shlishi l'tumah, and this can only include kodesh. So a kodesh, kudshim, is holier than truma. So again, one of the earlier points that we made is that the holier something is, the more susceptible it is to even very, very, we'll call very mild traces of tumah. The final slide. So we're there. I tried to keep you between 45 minutes and an hour, so actually running ahead of time. I didn't know how long this was going to take, so I probably spoke a little faster than I needed to. I'd be honored if you listen to me again, but no need to. But hopefully this was helpful. For purification from tumah, so a couple of important points. Purification typically involves immersion in a mikvah. We all know what a mikvah is, although we're not really discussing tonight what a mikvah is, but we all know in concept what it is, probably what it looks like, even though the details, the laws of mikvahs are very, very complicated. Or a mayan, which I mentioned earlier, is an underground spring. Even after immersion, there are times when tumah remains until the end of the day. There's the same thing happening again with that typo. Very strange. There are times when it will remain until the end of the day. Depending on the source of tumah, there are different periods of time that must pass before purification may begin. So we know this already because I mentioned this earlier, but we won't say, well, you're tameh, so here's when you go to the mikveh. It really depends on what the source of the tumah is and what the circumstances are, whether this is a case of nida, you're ledes, whether you get a boy or a girl, whether it's a case of mitzora, whether you touch the sheretz with balkari. So again, it's going to depend. And this is why, this requires a lot more study in order to really master the laws of Tumah and Tahara. At times, as we know, purification involves haza'ah, which we sometimes translate as sprinkling, right? Perhaps the most famous example is the hazas mechatos, the special water that is used to purify a person became tamei meis. And at times, special sacrifices must be brought in order to complete the purification process, right? So today, obviously, we don't bring karbanos, but bisman amikdash, there are certain types of tara which can only happen through the bringing of karbanos. So the best example, not the only example, would be a mitzora, but the same is true regarding other types of tum as well. So just because a person goes to the mikveh may not be the only step that is needed. Your purification process is just that. It is a process which includes different steps and measures depending on the circumstances. So, my friends, there you have it. Pure and simple. An overview of the laws of Tumah Tahara. I tried my best to present you with as much detail as possible without hopefully overloading you and overwhelming you with too much and more than you could possibly process in one moment. But again, this was designed to be a little bit, what do we call it? Demystifying. So what we're trying to do over here is take a little bit of the mystification away. There is something very mystifying about Tumah, needless to say. It is something which is it transcends our ability to understand. Tumah is not the kind of thing that we can measure in a laboratory. As I mentioned already, even Tumas Haguf is something which we would call metaphysical. And we're, for the most part, we're not really so familiar with it. So this really is a very strange and unfamiliar and mystifying area of Jewish law. On the other hand, it is a major, major section of the Torah. One of the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah is called Seder Taharos. So there's a lot of study a lot of Torah that we can and should study and learn, which involves the laws of Tumah. So hopefully this was a nice introduction for some of us to review. And for those of you who are intrigued and interested and want to learn beyond, again, the Torah, Torah Shebachsav, Torah Sheba'al is full of much material to study so we become more familiar with these laws. Next week, we are going to discuss together Olam Haba, previewing paradise. What do we actually know about Olam Haba? I can tell you not much, but then you won't come back next week, so I won't say that. So come back next week, and we'll know what we actually know about Olam Haba. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful night.